Alright boys, let's start this video review for Summer Rosanna. I have to get the video out today because I am gonna be busy on the following days. I am gonna have to send my PC for repair, so unfortunately I'm gonna have another solo raid where I'm gonna be using Scuff PC. In any case, let's get right into it. For Summer Rosanna, should you pull? Before you decide whether you want to pull or not, these are kind of like a few checklists and questions that I would probably try to answer. Basically, this is more of a Team 4, Team 5 alternative if we wanna use Summer Rosanna. And the main thing about it is because for Summer Rosanna, she has the sustained damage team with Summer Sakura, right? But then if you don't want to build like the shotgun team, for example, or like Snow White team or rocket launcher or electric team, then Summer Rosanna is an option that you can start using also with Summer Sakura. And yeah, basically if you want to use her and you want to use Summer Sakura, then Summer Rosanna is a pretty decent option. Now the thing is, Blanc and Noir compared to Summer Rosanna plus Helm is about roughly kind of like a side grade to me, when basically Helm kind of acts more as a healer. So if we need like a healer, then Helm is like a option for a healer, and then you have Blanc and Noir. And so typically the team that can kind of like be used with Blanc and Noir can also somewhat work with Summer Rosanna and Helm. Now if you don't have Helm, you can use Bunny Alice, Rapunzel, Summer Mary. Use it as an alternative, and it's a little bit more flexible in terms of like if we're just gonna compare it with Blanc and Noir, the bunnies. Now you could use Naga as your healer, but typically you don't want to separate it with Crown and Tia, so you're just gonna leave it alone. Now, is it gonna be better than bunnies? It can be if there is no healer. Now, is it less than bunnies? I'll give you some comparison later down the road once we get into the team section. How I kind of see Summer Rosanna is performing compared to other units as well. And lastly, if you want to pull, should you go for future sustained damage units? If you want to go for that, then that's an option as for Summer. One of the reasons why, because Summer Rosanna is a limited unit. We don't know if they're gonna add more in the future as well that synergizes with that, and then you can't really get her anymore, right? Like she's not going to be in the wish list because she is a summer limited. So you know, unless they somehow change it later down the road. But yeah, right now that's the main thing. Now, other questions though, should you pull her? Should you get one copy? Ask yourself this in terms of content. For campaign purposes, I would say no. Because pretty much like Crown or Tia Naga or bunnies are just better for campaign purposes in terms of burst 2. So she is not really that useful for campaign purposes. Union rate purposes, she can be used for now. Also, she is an option, especially for example if you start deciding to use Crown with Naga as your team 1, and then now you have bunnies as your team 2, and then what's your team 3, right? It could be shotgun or it could be her. I do see though that she can be easily phased out in the future if there are better units that it can support for burst 2. So for union rate purposes, I do see that she is the most easily replaceable, even though you can kind of use her if you have invested in her. Now for solo raid purposes, I would say it's more on yes, but it depends on the other teams that you're willing to build. And then I've also just kind of talked about it. I'm gonna release another video about like Summer Sakura, but basically Summer Sakura was almost like usable in about, if I have to use Summer Sakura in the past solo raid bosses, there's only going to be about half of the solo raid bosses where Summer Sakura would be useful. And then I guess in that similar regard, I think Summer Rosanna would be somewhat similar in that as well, where she would be useful in like about like half of the solo raid bosses. I would say it's more on yes, but again, depends on what kind of team are you willing to build as your team 4 and team 5. Now for PvP, in terms of what she does, Blanc is just way better for PvP. Blanc has the indomitability and has higher debuff ratio, and there's no parts to take advantage of it. She's just not good for PvP. And for co-op, I don't know if we're ever gonna replace Crown in terms of that. But you know, if you're gonna use for co-op, just ask a simple maxer. There's gonna be someone who definitely maxed her somewhere down the road there. But I don't think you should pull for co-op anyways, like, if I have to be honest. So those are the main checklist in terms of whether should you get her or not. That's gonna be up to you. Okay, do you need dupes? Primarily the reason is the lobby. If I have to be really honest with you, just like this lobby is that's really the main reason for it. Otherwise it's not really worth the duplicates from skill 1. The damage increase that you're getting is barely anything, and not to mention she is also a supporter, so there's like some diminished compared to, like, say, Noir in terms of like the buff that you're giving per dupes. So yeah, anyways, basically if you have to ask, the answer is no, you don't need dupes for her, so just one copy is more than enough. Now for skills, how to build her, she's basically a 4-4-10. Skill 1 and skill 2 barely gives any additional damage increase. They give additional parts damage to the team, but I mentioned already in the previous Summer Rosanna situation, the damage increase on the parts is once the parts are gone, then you don't really get any more damage from the boss. You're not dealing more damage to the boss unless the boss has unlimited parts. Then sure, your damage is gonna be way higher, but then typically once the parts are done and they respawn at specific times, you can only get so much damage from the parts. And if you have attack up or whatever it is, you just get the same amount of points from the parts. Now the only other thing where I could see the parts being very useful is overcapping damage. And so that would be something like Snow White, for example. So you can totally use like Snow White and to overcap damage on parts. So if the boss has a lot of parts in it, then that's where I could totally see having parts bonus damage increase is actually useful. Now another thing is the burst 3. Basically the goal is to just max it out. It's about roughly about 12% damage increase team wide when you max out her burst from level 1. But yeah, skill 1 and skill 2 barely much anything else, but I could totally see her being used if you want to cheese like some future bosses with like Snow White and overcapping damages. Totally, that's a possibility. After that's Overload, attack and elemental as usual, but the last line is pretty much not anything in particular. Ammo, critical, whatever it is, hit rate. The main reason for that is because none of her kit really relies on that. I mean, you could say critical is probably good, but at the end of the day, she doesn't do a lot of damage on her own, and none of her kits is like reliant on number of hits or anything like that. So pretty much anything. If I have to be honest, just I probably wouldn't overload it. Also, I'm running out of resources for food and credits, so it's like I probably wouldn't. And again, it's because of how skill 1, the scaling from your attack is not much. But if you are ever gonna overload her, I would just overload it, but I wouldn't re-roll it, just so that you can get the stats increase from the helmet, gloves, and armor because of the attack, and that way you can scale your skill 1. Now cube, it can be really anything, again similarly, because none of her kit really like is particularly about like shooting a certain amount of time. Resilience, Bastion, or Quantum, your highest level is pretty good. Otherwise, like, it's whatever it is. And then finally treasure, just yeah, just you don't really need treasure for her. I mean, you can equip it if you really want to get the raw stats from it, but there's so many other units to upgrade that it's not worth like investing treasure right now. Now for the teams, let's start talking about the teams though, because the teams for her is pretty much the standard as kind of like we have known it. We have talked about it a lot. Litter, Rosanna, and Summer Sakura are pretty much the standard staple, and then you kind of fill it in with whatever it is. Typically, this is your off flex unit, so the ones that don't burst. It could be another DPS, it could be another support, so it could be Moderna in here, or it could be like, say, Maxwell as just a buffer. It doesn't necessarily have to be Maxwell to be the one bursting. And then like the middle one, it can be like another burstery or healer. There's a lot of flexibility on it. Bunny Alice, for example, as your other healer, and that's the standard structure. And you pretty much like almost don't really move out litter in here, at least in particular for Sakura. Now the thing is, like, you don't necessarily have, if you're not using Sakura, because you don't have to use Sakura, the way it kind of set up is you try to replicate the side grade of bunnies. The side grade of bunnies is basically Rosanna, and she kind of acts as similar to Blanc, and then Helm as the healer. And the good thing about Helm is she also provides like the attack damage increase. So in a sense, you can kind of build it this way with Rosanna and Helm. The other team that you could like slap into is basically just building on top of the default team like this, where you have Guilty as kind of like, she does increase the stacks for the win code allies, and would kind of help Rosanna a little bit to upkeep that. Basically it's just the off unit, right? So in case you don't want to use Guilty, then you can use like Moderna, for example. Ludmilla is the main one to say like buff across the board. That's because like typically you could use Maxwell, but a lot of people have like a very invested Maxwell, and chances are a lot of you are probably gonna have like higher attack Maxwell than your Summer Sakura, because I don't think a lot of you would probably have hyper invested on Summer Sakura. And so in that situation, typically it's going to be difficult to kind of play around who's going to be the higher attack in that regards. There's other ways too. So for example, like you could do this as well, where you're using Maxwell as kind of like a buffer and like your fast charger with Ludmilla and Sakura. So that's like one team that you could use. And this is like, again, just kind of like the temporary team, because we don't have a lot more sustained damage right now anyways. Now this team is basically, you might notice, it's just, it doesn't have any healer. That's just how it is. But again, like if you do end up like needing a healer, there's a lot of substitutes that you can do. That's the good thing about her, is you can pretty much like flex on that. I could see like a default team to be something like this, where you have like Rosanna and Sakura and Helm, and then Moderna and Litter. You have your healer check. You have like the combination with Sakura and Rosanna and Litter, and then like Moderna as kind of like the additional DPS. Now the good thing about this one also, and you might notice like, okay, typically bunnies will be using Litter, right? Or could be Tianaga or whatever, but since we're using Litter here, one other thing that we could start opening up as well, and this is just as a side note, is that like your shotgun team can start evolving into something like this with the bunnies, for example. Since let's say like you're using Moderna, you used to use Moderna here, now you can kind of like evolve the bunnies into the shotgun team instead, and you don't have to build like Leona and maid privity in this situation. So I would probably like use like another Guilty in here as just like an additional DPS, but it can be really anything here. Other DPS that whatever element is needed. I mean, I could also just use maid privity if I really want to. So it's just like a pseudo side thing as an after effect, because of you trying to move around some of like your units into something like this, where you use Litter in here. And then now the question is, what would Bunny start using? How does she kind of perform? And really, it's in particular, this is just gonna talk, I'm just gonna talk about if we need like a particular healer, but basically if there's a boss with parts in there, Summer Rosanna plus Helm is actually better than Bunnies for Summer Sakura, and then Summer Rosanna and Helm is actually roughly equal for everyone else if it's a boss with parts. Now if it's a boss with no parts though, it does underperform. In this particular situation, Summer Rosanna plus Helm versus the bunnies is roughly equal for Summer Sakura, but then the damage decrease that you're taking if you do end up like using it without any parts, it is pretty down here also. And then finally, you can actually just, an alternative is actually novel. We can actually just use as an alternative on it. But the way I see it is Summer Rosanna feels more like just a side grade with a lot of units. And historically, novel has been also part of our comparison in terms of like burst to performance. Like for example, with mass, novel was actually roughly similar performance to units that have like HP increase, so like 2B. Elegg, I believe, if I recall correctly, novel was also roughly performing as that. And so that's kind of how I see it. Like Rosanna seems to be as a side grade, and if it lines up with Sakura, then it is actually like, which is a sustained damage, then it is performing well. So that's kind of how I see Summer Rosanna. She is definitely just a lot of side grade compared to the other B2, which is actually kind of nice. I can see how a lot of people are probably just going to be withholding their resources, because if it's not like overly great or anything like that, then why would you pull for it, right? I can totally see that argument. But for the most part, the way I really see it is the team is roughly going to be something like this right now for Summer Rosanna. Now, moving on, what's the pros and cons? Pretty much like a flexible burst 2 unit where you can kind of just open up like the different Solar Raid team building. Another good thing about her is she is pretty much cheap to build. Primarily, you need for skill is the burst, and then you don't need a lot of overloads at all so that she can give a good performance. And then another thing is that her burst is unconditional 10 seconds damage taken debuff, and if we don't end up needing a healer, then she can perform better than bunnies because you do get like a free extra DPS/support slot. Now the downside is there's no defensive or heals, and really we need like parts destruction or sustained damage for pretty much her full potential. And then the content usage for her is primarily like solo raid. But yeah, that's kind of like the hopefully quick TLDR, but I don't know how long this video is gonna be. It's gonna be pain for me. I have to edit this out, get this out of the way, so that I can get this video, because I'm gonna be sending my PC off for repair. I'm gonna have streaming again with debuff, and I'm gonna do solar raid again with debuff. So, but I will try to get a solar raid video out as well. So we'll see. And actually this solar raid might be a little bit more fun because I kind of see actually there's like a lot of variety with so many kind of team opening up right now. It's actually going to be interesting how people are going to start min-maxing it. And actually I see a lot of like very varied teams on it depending on like which accounts it is. But yeah, I mean overall these units doesn't seem like they overly power creep, and they do have their niche, so I think that's a good thing. But at the same time, I can see how people are gonna be like, yeah, this is not what I'm looking for, or yeah, I'm gonna keep saving for like a more broken unit. But yeah, otherwise, like really it's just team 4, team 5 building, solar raid, and cope for sustained damage units later down the road. I don't know how much shift up is gonna push this down our throat. That's just like how they did shotgun. They just kept shoving in like shotgun units to eventually until it starts working. I don't know if that's the same thing as that's gonna happen for sustained damage units.